He was going to introduce me. My name is Falck-Zepeda. I'm a research fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And this is a presentation that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about socioeconomics. And in particular, I'm going to focus on assessments and its relationship to biosafety. The importance of this topic is really because some of these discussions are ongoing in international arenas, in particularly the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. The next COPA meetings in Delhi, India in 2012 will include socioeconomic considerations as part of the substantive issues that need to be discussed by all the different parties of the protocol. So there's some internal discussions within the Philippines and in many other countries around the world on this exact topic. And I thought it was pertinent for at this juncture in time. Let me just give you the basic message that I want to convey up front, and then of course you can go if you want to. I guess that was accomplished my mission. Basically what I wanted to say is the assessment of socioeconomic considerations related to the adoption of genetically modified crops or genetically engineered crops provide useful knowledge for decision makers. That's a given. But we have to start thinking about economic assessments or socioeconomic assessments within the scope of a regulatory process. One in particular that will be a decision-making process, meaning that a technology will be approved, not approved, or will be delayed for further information at one point. Now, if the country has reached the decision that they want to include socioeconomic considerations in their assessments in this particular process, then the question becomes one of implementation, ensuring that that such inclusion will become a feasible in contributing to the goal of a functional biosafety system. That's the lowdown, the basic message from this presentation, and we'll explore many of these components in my presentation. To do that, I'll divide it in a couple of components, I guess, of parts of this discussion. One is I'll discuss a little bit about economic considerations as related to biosafety regulation, give a little bit of our experience by biosafety assessments or socioeconomic assessments and some of the reviews we have done. The third will be inclusion in decision making. I'm going to relate to you a couple of experiences of countries that have practical experience with this or some that don't. And then finally, a little bit about practical considerations for inclusion of such socioeconomic considerations. Let me first start by defining what are socioeconomic consideration assessments. Of course, there's a diverse research focus. We can always focus on the household, on the individual, farm, communities, industry, consumer, and trade. And we can focus on even further specific items such as gender, health, age, institutional issues, generational issues, migration to urban areas, and so on. Now, these assessments can be done before the adoption of a technology or before the delivery of a technology, that is the ex-ante assessment, or after the adoption of the technology, or if this is the ex-post situation. Now, in terms of regulations, particularly for the approval of new technologies, in the particular case of genetically modified crops, most of the assessments will be ex-ante, before the fact. So you start seeing a little bit the complications of this type of approach because, of course, we have to make a lot of assumptions in those assessments about the potential performance of the technology. Now, in those assessments, we usually contrast the effect of the intervention, meaning the release of the technology, against a potential alternative, which in some cases may be another technology, such as a conventional hybrid or a conventionally derived variety. Certainly, impact assessment is a scientific process because it uses a scientific methodology, hypothesis testing, several scientific methods. But at the same time, we know as practitioners that it does incorporate art into its implementation. We have to use judgment a lot of times in terms of the models, the assumptions, the many data, even to supplement data that is non-existent in some cases. So in that sense, we are addressing subjectively many problems with the different limitations for the assessment. I don't want to be completely negative. A colleague of mine, Gruere and Pal from India, they suggest that well-conducted studies can weigh benefits and costs for better decisions, provide useful lessons. In particular, you can avoid some costly mistakes, suggested management practices to increase benefit from use, and support economically beneficial applications and pave the way for promising new technologies. In a sense, I think the key should have highlighted the well-conducted part of the socioeconomics, because we have seen many studies that are not well conducted and in fact are quite poor in their implementation. And that becomes a matter of excellence in terms of the academic content of such and the intellectual content of such studies. And this is one thing that is important, because once again, this will be related to a decision to approve or reject the technology in this environment. So what drives the socioeconomic inclusion in the biosafety decision-making processes? One, of course, is knowledge creation. We want to know about these technologies. We want to understand the role of technology in society and these processes. But then there's also some of the more political aspects of it. For example, regional treaties, regional considerations, participation in different events and conferences and treaties, national laws and regulations. And particularly one of the main drivers of this has been the Cartagena Protocol of Biosafety itself. And I'll give you a little bit of sense of where that is coming from. But then of course there are other political, institutional, and stakeholder interests in using this type of approach to help or in some cases hinder the development of these technologies in some cases. Let me just go specifically to the Cartagena Protocol of Biosafety, particularly Article 26.1. Article 26.1 was the result of a very extensive negotiation and consultation process that started from the point where the article itself said that it was going to be a mandatory process that would include everything that people could imagine into these assessments, all the way to one where this is the end result, where basically the article said in the second part that the application of such article is going to be voluntary, meaning that countries are free to decide whether they want or they don't want to include socioeconomic considerations into a biosafety decision-making process, into a regulatory approval process. So in that sense, there also are other considerations, because in that sense, the scope of the article, if you go back to this part over here, you can see that the negotiations for this particular article meant that there is a specific focus and a specific impact indicator. We're talking about the socioeconomic consideration from the impact of living modified organisms, that's the term used in the protocol, on the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. So it doesn't have to say anything about, in reality, socioeconomics. It talks about biodiversity. Remember, the Cartagena Protocol itself is a biodiversity treaty. And in fact, I would even argue, I'm a little bit of a cynic myself, sometimes it's more of a trade agreement than anything else, because it regulates trade between nations. It has been expanded in terms of focus in many ways. But I'll come back to that point in a little while. But then again, the other part of it is there is a specific impact indicator, the value of biodiversity to indigenous and local communities. So in essence, this article is saying, if a country decides under the protocol to include socioeconomics, it is going to concentrate basically on the value of biodiversity to a very specific subsector of its population. And that's a little bit of a very restricted, very narrow view of the world. But then again, we go back to this part over here, may take into account their domestic measures, meaning that countries are free to do whatever they want. If they want to put everything, that's fine. That's their prerogative. It's a sovereign decision. So that's important. Once again, and I think I made this point already. One thing when we're talking about technology assessments, because we're pursuing a scholarly research, another thing is that when we're doing a technology assessment, where there is a regulatory decision in the end, meaning that a technology will be approved. So the difference between those two, they will share many times methods and approaches and the logic and so on and implementation, is the fact that for biosafety regulatory purposes, we have to also consider the impact of the inclusion of socioeconomic considerations in decision making, the cost and benefits of inclusion. And then at the same time, the relationship and the interaction with the risk assessment process itself. Remember, biosafety is composed of two basic components. One is the environmental assessment, and the other one is the food, feed, and human health and animal health component, which are two separate processes that come together into this decision of what is called biosafety. On top of that, we're going to have a third one, which is going to be a socioeconomic assessment, and we're talking about three different groups of people that are speaking different terms, different languages in so many cases, even though they may be speaking Tagalog or English or French or Spanish where I come from, but they're speaking, it's going to be a hard decision to make. So in that sense, we have to consider what are the impacts then on innovation, opportunities lost or gained in some cases due to additional regulatory hurdles, and who is impacted more by regulatory actions and technology decisions. This is a bit of an expansion of the type of thing. This is what is usually the case for what is called regulatory impact assessment, meaning the effects of a particular regulation on society in general. Now, this is a little bit more in terms of the bigger picture. When we're talking about creating a biosafety regulatory process, we have to establish somehow a balance between democratic society's right to know, the freedom to operate, meaning farmers' freedom to operate, and consumers' freedom to choose. And in some cases, they may be in contradiction one against the other. In some cases, we have seen that, for example, that the modality of a lot of the research systems in the world used to be centered around what is best for farmers. But we know from the reaction of different consumer groups, particularly in Europe and parts of the Middle East and parts of Asia, Japan, South Korea, there's been a strong movement towards the understanding the type of technology, specifically in the case of genetically modified crops, understanding in some cases coming to the point that they want to know where that particular production has been made. They want to know who produced that. And in some cases, they're talking about tracing from fork or from producer to fork, basically. I don't know how they're going to do it in here, but in my country where I come from, that's next to impossible. Who knows who produced what? Anyhow, everything is moved down. We have talked also about this a little bit. For regulatory purposes, we're going to be talking mostly about the Anexante assessment. Like I mentioned before, a lot of assumptions, a lot of issues with the assessments, a lot of limitations, and certainly when I usually tell people, well, how do you judge your own research? And I tell them, well, I use my research, but I don't believe in it. So in essence, it's a matter of being skeptical about the research, because I know, and we know all of the limitations, and those who are like me, who are practitioners in this art and science, we know all of these limitations. So in essence, when we're talking about then decision-making and the inclusion of socioeconomics, we have to start asking some hard questions about this design, or the design of the regulatory process. We have to start asking questions of feasibility, for example. Can a specific socioeconomic issue be assessed ex ante or ex post? In some cases, there have been some countries that have gone as far asking for religious, for ethical, aesthetic considerations into decision making. And one of the big questions is, can you assess that ex ante before the fact? Can you project that potential benefit? This is an open question. Or in some other cases, they've been talking about unintended consequences of a particular introduction. Well, the big question is, if it's unintended, can you project an unintended consequence? I don't know. That's open for discussion. So there are other questions in terms of utility, in terms of regulatory impacts, in terms of fit with the decision-making process and so on. So these are questions that are extremely important for countries, even though the decision has been made. It is important that the country is able to answer a lot of these questions, because that gives a lot of strength to the process itself, because countries are actually providing a rationale behind that regulatory design in that sense. So let's move on a little to what we know. We conducted a review of 137 peer-reviewed studies. These are strictly economic studies, with of course a lot of social content in them. But we examined studies looking at farmers, households, communities, industry, markets, consumer, and trade. And let me tell you a little bit of background of this study. When we first started doing the first thing we did was a Google Scholar search. We hit, by the time it was done, over 10,000 hits Then we say, no, we have to narrow this down. In reviewing 10,000 hits is going to be almost next to impossible. So we also introduced this requirement that it had to have some sort of peer review, and it had to have explicit economic methods in the explicit methods. We ended up with 187, out of which we had to discard another 50 or so. We ended up with 137. Let me move on to the conclusions of that particular study. By the way, the gentleman over there on the right holding the cotton farm, that's one of the first times I've seen a cotton farmer arrives to show his cotton production. He's the head of a cooperative. He arrived in a brand new Audi, the black Audi. So it's a very expensive car. But anyhow, that's another story. I hope that all farmers can become just like that. I mean, if everybody's going to be happy that way. The results of our studies show that on average, the studies showing that the technologies that have appeared to date, and this is a very important point, that they have been profitable, but at the same time, we know that those averages mask variabilities by agroclimate, cross-cultivar trait, and by farmer-to-farmer variations. We also have seen that there are too few traits, too few cases, and thus at this point it is very hard to make generalizations. We need more time to describe adoption. Now, in that sense, it is important from the one hand, it is very good that the results have been good in that sense in terms of profits. And then from the other standpoint, we know that this conclusion is very weak in that sense. So, in part, this is a result of the way that so far that all of these technologies have deployed. We're talking about 4 basic technology, or 4 basic crops: maize, cotton, soybeans, and canola, which is a type of rapeseed, and 2 basic traits: insect resistance, BT mostly, and herbicide tolerance, and combinations of the 2. Now, these technologies were mostly developed by developed countries for developed countries so far. The implication is that some of them were they managed to transfer and they work in many developing countries, but the other part of the story is also as true, that developing countries are investing and have invested in a lot of technologies, but they're farther behind in the regulatory pipeline. In fact, we documented 237 events around the world in 16 countries that are in some way in a regulatory process. Out of those, only 2 countries have released a public sector technology developed by the public sector: China and India. And I think there's one in a couple of Cuba and a couple of other places, but that's a little bit hard to document. So what do we need in terms of the next decade? We need to start thinking a little bit about the cross-cutting issues for further study, including impacts on poverty, gender, public health, generational, and so on. But at the same time, we need to improve the methods to examine these broader issues. Our methods are extremely limited in that sense. We need to expand. And by the way, of course, the implication of this is, by conclusion, that we have to go beyond the economics into the other sciences, the other social sciences, and the biophysical sciences to start doing something in collaboration, which is easier said than done in many ways. One of the first things that we're doing is we're conducting a study on the particular impact or the relationship between gender and the adoption and impact of a particular technology. In this case, we are studying the BT Roundup Ready maize in the Philippines. This is a joint study between INPRI and UPLB, and we have Dr. Jose Llorobe Jr. and Dr. Delita Cabanilla. Those are our local counterparts, and they're going to be conducting the study, which we hope we're going to have some results by early next year. I don't expect you to read what is inside here, but the idea here was to bring about this sense that gender, it cuts across many different domains in terms of input decisions, in terms of relationship with the technology developers, in terms of impact on farm practices, and so on. Now, and I hope that you probably have read a couple of articles that have talked about socioeconomics. In particular, there's one by Franzen, Lavinia, and a couple of other people, where they provide like a little list of the different issues that could be addressed. And I just bring up this is even more expanded, even larger list than what I had before. But let me move on to the next slide, because what I really wanted to say to you is that, in a sense, the list of potential issues should not be viewed as a checklist. We have to carefully choose which issues are relevant to the technology adoption making process. In some cases, some issues may be relevant. In some other cases, they won't be as relevant. And so it's important to start understanding, but that means that there's a process of observation and understanding of the phenomenon in greater detail than what we usually have. And that is an important process, and it becomes a little bit of a research process in itself. Let me just kind of guide you a little bit about what economics view of the world is, or economists view of the world. If we have a kind of a flat line, what I would call zero profit, surplus, cost to benefit, or livelihoods, which is a little bit stretching the concept here. In some cases, some things will reduce that, and by the way, these are not drawn to scale, they are just meant to be quantitative. For example, the technology fee will reduce profit for farmers. The decrease in pesticide applications, in the case of BT, it will increase profit or improve the livelihood usually of a person. That increase in yield, which in that sense is not a true increase in yield, but it's more of a reduction in the damage caused by the insect, which brings, by the way, one of the most important limitations of those studies. What happens if there are no insect at that particular point? There's no damage. So there's no benefit for that particular technology. But it's a little bit of a technical point, which we need to kind of at the same time address in our studies. The additional cost of controlling secondary pests once the primary pest is being controlled, that reduces profit. But then there's also the economic effect, because there's a sudden burst of a commodity in the market. There might be a price decrease. But then there might be impacts on labor. Labor may be decreased because of the decrease in pesticides, or may be increased if, for example, there's additional yield, additional output that is actually have to be collected. And what are the trade-offs? So in the end, all of these positives have to be weighed against the negatives. Obviously, from the standpoint of calculating a net benefit in the end, we have to collect data on each one of these blocks. And there are many other blocks that we can start thinking about over here. This is just for illustration purposes. But then, of course, the big question in an ex-ante study is the big uncertainty that we have. We don't know what these things may happen in reality. So it becomes a little bit of a decision-making under risk in that sense. So we have to somehow, and it's reflected in most models nowadays, that you introduce probabilities into this, just to try to address that uncertainty about the parameters themselves. And by the way, I forgot one. Management convenience factor. One of the interesting things and one of the lessons we learned about reviewing some of the, in fact, in the case of some developed countries, was the case of Roundup-Ready soybeans, the herbicide-tolerant soybeans, that in most cases they did not show any economic benefit at that particular point. And why then the US is basically 95% soybean is herbicide tolerant. Argentina is almost 99%. Brazil is getting there. Why? Why if there's no economic benefit? Well, this is one of many explanatory factors. Basically, farmers love the stuff because they apply once, maybe a second time, and then they forget about it. And it also introduces the idea of introducing zero tillage and low tillage systems, particularly in the case of soybeans. In Argentina, it's basically no till or zero till or minimum till in that situation. So there's lots of things that need to be considered. So let me give you a couple of examples of studies that we conducted. One is an ex-ante study we conducted in bananas. We estimated that the production of a black Sigatoka resistant banana in Uganda would represent more or less social benefits of approximately $200 million per year. The idea here is that this is a staple crop, it's a subsistent crop. Most Ugandans have the highest consumption of bananas in the world, and controlling, it couldn't be controlled by using fungicides. The only problem is that fungicides are extremely expensive, are not available, and in many cases farmers just take the losses due to that particular disease. So in essence, it has a lot of implications, and it's a product developed by the public sector. It's developed by somewhere between the University of Leuven in Belgium and the National Agricultural Research Organization of Uganda. It's a public sector release, or it's going to be a public sector release. It's still undergoing confined field trials at this point. Let me give you a study closer to home. This was a study conducted by Dr. Gruere back in 2008 here in the Philippines. And in the end, his conclusions was that growing maize significantly increases profits and yields to adoptive farmers. He found significant insecticide reductions, and these results, I would say, are extremely robust because he did control for many of the things that may affect that difference, which tend to inflate those differences in other studies, specifically using very, very sophisticated econometric methods. But at the end, One of the important things to understand is that adopters in the area tended to be larger, used higher labor, were more educated, and have more positive perceptions of current and future status. That, in a sense, is an indication of what we call sampling bias. First adopters tend to be the best farmers, and the larger farmers, and the richer farmers. And so, in that sense, we have to control for those differences and to account what would happen if there was a broader adoption of farmers, which Dr. Gruere did very successfully. And he found that, and you can see some of the estimations on the right for his particular study. This is a study closer to my own home. I come from Honduras in Central America, so I conducted a study of BD Roundup Ready maize in Honduras. It did provide excellent yield control. It provided somewhere between 890 and 1,100 kilos of the grain that was actually not attacked by the pest. But at the same time, it is a technology that has 100% higher seed cost than a conventional hybrid. Thus, there were limitations in terms of credit and adoption by smallholder farmers. This is something that the government, in a sense, that was one of our recommendations, has to think about credit and the potential access by smallholder farmers in the country. So let me talk a little bit, let me try back now. We have a little bit about the background, a little bit about some of the results, and these are more or less the results that have been obtained in many of the studies. You can see the wide variety, wide variability of these results, and in conclusion, this is no different than any other technology that has happened since we actually adopted the fire, for example. Somebody got burned, somebody got beneficial, got cooking, and so on. Some people were indifferent, and so on. So there's no difference than any other technology adoption. There's some benefits, there's some costs, there's some risk, and so in that sense, the big question now becomes, what is it that we're going to do to maximize the benefits and minimize the risk in this sense? So let me give you now a little bit of an idea of what countries are doing in terms of socioeconomic assessments in inclusion in biosafety decision-making processes. We have two interesting examples, Argentina and Brazil. It's starting to look like a World Cup, I guess. I won't point out they're going to have very bad teams right now. But they're interesting countries because they're both adopters of the technology. They are really massive adopters, and they have been very aggressive about adopting the technology. In particular in soybeans, and now in Brazil, sugarcane for bioethanol production. They're starting to look into that very well. Argentina, the inclusion of socioeconomic assessments is mandatory as part of the biosafety regulatory process, but it's a very, very narrow scope. They are only interested in trade and competitivity at this point. They don't care at this point about anything else. Well, it's not that they don't care, it's that it's not included in their regulations. Now, they're really considering whether or not they should start moving and expanding that definition to include impacts on farmers. And that's, in a sense, a result of their expanding the type of crops they have. Because it used to be that it was only soybeans that were GM at that point, and 99% of it is exported. Now they're expanding to other crops, which are more of interest to their farmers. Of course, then the regulatory system is responding. It is conducted by the Ministry of Trade and Finance, and is required until commercialization. Brazil is more or less the same story. Socioeconomic considerations are only considered if somebody during the assessment raises the issue. If somebody comes up with an observation or a requirement, then the regulatory body responds by commissioning a study that will study that specific item that is being raised during the assessment. In a sense, this is quite interesting because the Brazilian system has two separate bodies. One is CTM-BIO, which makes the biosafety assessments. Then there's the other one, which is the National Biosafety Council, which is the decision-making body. So in essence, the National Biosafety Council is the one that commissions those studies because they're the ones who are going to make the decision. So what happens is that the biosafety assessment is done first. Once the product is determined to be safe, then it moves on to the decision-making body, and in that sense, that it politicizes the process a little bit, or at least it allows completion of the biosafety process. It is required, in fact, up to commercialization too. We have two contrasting players over here. One is the European Union, the other one is USA and Canada, which are basically very similar in their approach. European Union, of course, as their members, their parties to the protocol, both as individual countries, but also as a bloc in a sense. USA and Canada are not parties to the protocol. They're observers in those deliberations. In the European Union, which, by the way, I guess the white doesn't show up very well, is this over here. It is still not clear whether or not it's mandatory, what is going to be required, who the proponent, whether or not it's going to be on approval and post-release monitoring, which is, in a sense, I can say is the usual state of affairs of the European Union, right? They're always discussing, and nobody knows kind of a clear answer. Whereas the US and Canada is this one over here. It is not required, and in fact, even if a proponent submits a socioeconomic study, the regulatory body does not have any obligation whatsoever to read even the material. They will accept it, but they don't have to consider it. Every single decision is made based on the risk assessment. And in fact, the legal philosophy, in a sense, is that everything, if something happens, it will be decided in the legal courts, and that's going to be the final stage. And so that gives you the clue that that type of system only works in places where the legal system is actually functioning. In many developing countries like mine, no, that won't happen. Now, going back to the European Union a little bit, this is a proposal made by the Netherlands Commission on Genetic Modifications, because of course the European Union has made out of this cause to start discussing these issues and come up with proposals. This is one of the first proposals that has come up. And you can see the different approaches and the different issues that have been proposed for this study and for inclusion into those biosafety assessments. This proposal will be discussed within the different parties of the European Union, and some form of it is probably going to be at one point accepted as kind of the normal practice in those countries. Okay, so now let's move on to the practical considerations and options for biosafety regulatory design. We know just by looking at the examples from the 4 different countries, and I will show you, I will share with you at one point the different articles that we have published discussing more in detail some of these issues. We started to see some of the regularities here. We're talking about designing or deciding on the what, the when, the how, the who, what type of decision-making style, and so on. This is the type of questions that we need to be asking at this point. We have to remember, once again, that this biosafety process, or the biosafety process itself, is part of a wider, which is a research and development process. And in fact, we're talking about from the start from conceptualization all the way to product delivery, we're probably talking about 12 years, or even in some cases more, of a process that will last for long. It is interesting because at the same time, this also starts giving you an idea of the potential cost and benefits of these technologies. And at the same time, it gives you that sense. If I'm sitting in a national agriculture research organization like NARO in Uganda or CARI in Kenya and so on, then you start asking if I'm the person who's going to make the decision whether or not to invest a couple of $1 million in developing a specific technology, which I'm going to see 12 years in the future. That's a hard decision, a hard question to make. So in essence, not only that, it's not only the value of the investment, but also the uncertainty about what is going to come out of that our research and development process. This is a very hard decision to make. So in terms of very specific considerations for regulatory design, we have several options in terms of the issues over here and the options. So, for example, we have seen that some countries, there's no inclusion, whether or not it's mandatory or whether or not it's voluntary. It could be submitted and it will be accepted and so on. We can start thinking about the scope, which might be a narrow interpretation of Article 26.1, all the way to broader assessments, be it, for example, social impact assessment or sustainable livelihood approaches and so on. Or we're talking about a concurrent process, meaning that you're conducting the biosafety assessment at this point, and you're also conducting the socioeconomic assessment at this point, or it's going to be sequential. You do the biosafety assessment and do the socioeconomic assessment after the biosafety. It's pretty much the Brazil situation. This is one of the important things, do you do it event by event, meaning that every single submission that is sent to the biosafety authority is assessed, or do you do it, each submission or event by event is a group or a type, or let's say insect resistance or herbicide tolerance, and then future submissions do not have to submit, they just kind of relate to the original submission When is it going to be done? Is it going to be done during laboratory or greenhouse or greenhouse, or is it going to be requested at commercialization? Well, of course, going back to our previous graph, we saw that a lot of this technology, it takes 12 years to go from conceptualization to delivery. And a lot of these technologies that start in the conceptualization phase or even the laboratory do not make it to commercialization. So it doesn't really make sense to request it at the laboratory. So it is preferable, if it's going to be required, to require at the commercialization stage. Are we talking about Anexante how, choice of methods? We're talking about decision-making rules and standards and so on. This is what I was talking about. It's not a little bit readable, but I think I published a couple of set of different papers in terms of discussing the issues, the approaches, the current status of the biosafety of the discussion, and so on. And these are available in some cases online, in some cases it's a review of policy research, a journal, which if anybody's interested, I can send you a copy of the paper itself. So let's talk about the implications then. So what are the implications in terms of including socioeconomic considerations? One of the first, most interesting, most important things is the potential for introducing uncertainty. Because once you start thinking about it, whether or not the approval of this particular technology will depend on the biosafety assessment and also on a socioeconomic assessment, which might be not completely compatible with one or the other, then we're introducing uncertainty to the process. This is especially true if we do not have very clear rules and standards for the decision-making process. And I'll illustrate this point in just a little while. I mentioned this before, we can gain more and better information about technology impacts for decision-making, but at that same time, then we have to, in a sense, balance against the information, against the additional cost and effort and innovation in that sense. And the next step, of course, is it goes back to this idea of gain in information. What do you do with the results of a socioeconomic assessment and the results of it? Let me illustrate what I mean with that. Let's assume that, and this is a very kind of simplified diagram of the decision-making process. We have the results of a socioeconomic assessment and the results of a biosafety assessment. And like I said before, the biosafety assessment is composed of the environmental and the food and feed safety. It's actually two different assessments. So this goes into the regulatory process. And let's assume for a second that the socioeconomic assessment gives you the result is a negative socioeconomic impact, but that is because there's some sort of institutional constraint to that particular technology, that particular crop. Let's assume that credit is the limitation. Let's assume for just a second. But from the standpoint, the biosafety assessment says that this product is safe for all intents and purposes. So what's the decision in this case? What does the regulatory body do? Do they not approve the technology? Do they require more information about the potential impacts of this technology? Or do you approve, but after resolving the institutional issues, which were the limitation that gave you the negative socioeconomic impact? Well, let's pause just a second, and I'll guarantee you that this is not going to happen because the regulatory body in many cases does not have the purview nor the authority to request resolving credit problems, for example. So in that sense, this becomes a little bit of a conflict because you are actually rejecting, penalizing a technology for actually something that is outside, in many cases, the technology situation. Of course, I'm making it a little bit negative in this case, but it could go the other way, of course, that there may be some potential benefits in terms of the delays and so on and so forth, of gaining better information. So this is something to ponder about, a little bit about the decision-making process. Other potential implications, the cost of compliance with regulations will increase. This is a given because you have to do a study which it has a cost in itself. The cost, and I'll give you a nice estimate that we have, the cost itself is not as important. It's only important for the public sector, which has limited funds, and perhaps some small private firms who might be doing some research. But the other part of the thing which is really important is that the time of completion of that research may increase, simply because there may be time needed to complete the study because there's some uncertainty about the study and so on. So in that sense, if these two are opposite effects, then there may be a reduction in the ability for the country to innovate, and if that's in a limiting situation. And in that case, it is important then to consider the impacts on the public sector, crops and trades of interest to the Philippines and to other developing countries. And this is one of the things I mentioned before, that there were 230, a study that we conducted, there were 237 technologies. A lot of it, they're stuck in the regulatory process because of the cost, and not only of socioeconomic consideration, but a lot of the cost of conducting the biosafety assessments. Once again, this is a matter of weighing the benefits of gaining more information against some of the costs. And in that sense, that implies some difficulties for the private and the public sector. Let me illustrate a little bit more what I meant. We estimated, and this is a paper done by Jessica Bayer, George Norton, and myself. These were estimates of 4 different technologies in the Philippines. This is the estimate of net benefits. This is net present value of net benefits over 20 years, I think that was the timeline. And they were different in terms of how much benefits they would potentially adopt. And these results have been modified since then. Now, what we did was a little experiment where on the one hand, we increased significantly the cost of compliance with biosafety regulations, or in this case, this might include a socioeconomic assessment. But then there's the other part, which is meaning that the delay or of the onset of the technology was delayed a little bit of time. Note over here, if we increase 400% the cost of developing that particular technology, or the cost of compliance, the effect was minimal. The cost related to the potential benefits was extremely insignificant. It didn't matter in reality. If 400% is a big increase in cost. But notice what happens when we increase the delay period for that particular technology. Look at that. The benefits in the case of the viral-resistant tomato decreased almost 93%. The BT eggplant almost 80%. In the case of the PRSD, papaya decreased 67%, with just a 3-year decrease in that particular delay, or in that particular release of a particular technology. So time is important. The time value of money is important in these calculations. So let me wrap up, because I think we need to leave some time for questions. And some of the key messages, I guess, in the sense after this is we need, as countries, it doesn't really matter if it's developing or developed countries, we need to clearly articulate why we want to include socioeconomic considerations in this decision-making process. Does that inclusion improve society's welfare? And then, of course, we have to justify the additional regulatory burden in innovation. That leads, in a sense, to if we want a feasible and functional system, we have to have in that situation clear decision-making rules and standards. Well, of course, that implies a careful evaluation of the benefits, costs, and risks and outcomes from the inclusion of socioeconomic assessments. And this is an interesting thought over here, because one of the many things that many people assume is that because we're blocking, particularly people who oppose the technology or any other technology, is that by approving, we're actually reducing the risk to society. Well, that's not always the situation. And in fact, the no action in many cases implies a risk of its own, because some of these technologies, some of the existing technologies are in themselves risky. There's an interesting paper by the Newfield Council of Bioethics that has a lot of these discussions in terms of the status quo being risky in itself. In the end, countries have many options and many choices. And I think, in a sense, it's the worst possible outcome in this sense is a process, a biosafety regulatory process, where we have a mandate, we will include socioeconomic considerations, but there's no implementation guidelines to the developer, to the different members of society. This breeds a lot of confusion and a lot of issues that need to be sorted out. So in the end, if socioeconomic inclusions are to be included in the biosafety process, then the key is for it to contribute to a functional assessment and a decision-making process. In that sense, we have to start thinking about whether or not the process itself is predictable, whether or not it's transparent, whether the assessment hurdle is proportional to the risk implied by the technology, whether or not it's cost and time efficient, whether or not it's maximizing the benefits of the adoption of the technology, and whether or not we have explicit rules and decision-making standards. This is part of this process in that sense. And by the way, the preamble of the Cartagena Protocol mentions that the protocol itself is not about prohibiting the technology, it's about maximizing the benefits of using the technology. That's the preamble of the protocol in itself. So, salamat po, and thank you so much.
In the approaches in the socioeconomic assessments, on the ex-ante approach, I mean, how sensitive are the results of the assessment when there are some problems in the assumptions and limitations you mentioned? How sensitive are the results?
They're extremely sensitive, and in fact, in many cases, one of the key things for the regulatory process or anybody who's actually going to judge the quality of the study itself that is being proposed is to actually judge if it adheres to best practices, because in many ways, in many cases, I can guarantee you that if you can actually, if you were in an unethical situation, you could manipulate the results to actually reflect whatever you want to present, be it positive or negative. So in that sense, that's one of the things. There's lots of uncertainties and lots of ways that it could lend itself to provide a skewed result, basically. So yes, they're extremely sensitive, and it's not. It might not even a kind of a conscious. It might be even unconscious. Like I mentioned the example, for example, of in some cases, for example, the BT. There's no insect. There's no insect tag. Therefore, there's no benefit. Some of the early models that we used did not consider that. So that's where the damage abatement models came into place, because they reflect that particular use. So some of it there's been some methodological progression, and in terms to address those limitations, like yes, but they're very sensitive to those.
Just one last question. On the ex-post approach, I mean, on the Honduras study and the one done by Chito, I mean, now, what sampling method did you use, and how did you come up with your sampling frames?
Well, I guess Chito can actually answer for the Philippines. In Honduras, it was a little bit more complicated because there were very few producers. So we first started by trying to do a stratified sample, or it was a little bit of a direct stratified sample, and we tried to do it by state and by province, and then sample with regions within but it became impossible because at one point, in our first passes for the surveys, we couldn't get a BT producer, for example. Most of them were hybrids. There are very few producers. So in the end, what we end up doing was basically a census. We grabbed 2 states, and every single producer that we could get, we included in the survey. So that's one of the weaknesses of that paper and that study. Simply, it was in the end it was not a stochastic sample. Yeah, it was very much a census. Chito, you want to add on the sampling for the Philippines? Yeah.
When the BT was first introduced in the Philippines, then we practically got very good proportion of users of BT. In fact, in some areas, it was practically complete enumeration of users. For the non-users, there's a lot of non-users were born. But nowadays, judging from the visits that we had in Isabela, we will have a hard time looking for non-BT users.
Yeah.
Practically the field is planted to BT and R. So that will certainly have influence in terms of the proportion that of samples that we get from these two groups.
Which, by the way, that was in the case of Uganda, it was pretty much a stratified sample where we kind of sample from the state-producing areas, then we sample at the province level, then we at the sub-province level, and then we selected farmers around them. We had the list of producers, which is always a good helpway, which is basically a stratified sample.
But to give you an idea, in the first round, we had, I think, about 500 samples altogether.
Yeah. And in Uganda, we had 466 farmers being sampled, where we conducted the survey.
I think that thing is it's like multi-stage something.
Yeah,
How you describe it? Not necessarily stratified randomly. Well, stratified, say, probably by region or probably.
Yeah, right. And you kind of keep on selecting from this, from the state there, up until you reach the individual producer level. Yeah.
Other comments? The gentleman in
I just came from a hearing in the House.
Sir, could you kindly use the microphone, please? And please state your name and your organizational affiliation, if any.
I am Coach of the Earth Savers Movement. I just came from a hearing in the House regarding BT Talong. And Congressman Padilla and Congressman Casino were complaining that there wasn't an apparent transparency in the freedom of information regarding the biosafety assessments, which is strictly plant biosafety, not human but plant, to be made available to the complaining NGOs and civic society groups and to the farmers. And so in this country, you have a problem of freedom of information. The technicians, the scientists don't like to share the information. As a matter of fact, the successful Los Baños BT plant testing that was done here, the Sea Rice and NGO requested for a complete copy of the 400-page report, and only the first 6 pages, the abstract was given, not the methodology, not the results, not the analysis, but only the first 6 pages. And so you have that problem, and I am concerned that your addition of socioeconomic assessment will essentially institutionalize greed and profit as another reason for approving BT technology without even passing the biosafety assessment for plant, and not even doing the human assessment for human beings, because unfortunately the BT Talong representative in the House today declared that since only the site trials in Luzon were done, they might decide immediately to allow commercialization in the Luzon island of the Philippines, which is totally contrary to the rules of the game. You have to do the test for at least 2 seasons in all the 3 archaeologic regions of the Philippines before you can even think about commercializing. And that was an unfortunate statement by the BT Talong person. She revealed that they will make a decision even without any human biosafety assessments, even without a complete archaeologic 2-season test of the BT Talong.
Well, I should not make a comment on the internal issues within the Philippine regulatory system, right? Certainly there is this issue of the general principle of having transparency, and in fact I think that if you see so many of the SCBP publications, there's availability of a lot of availability of information in their website. But I would say that, let me just also expand that this is not only about profits, because as we saw, when you're doing a socioeconomic assessment, you're also considering different aspects. For example, in the study we'll be conducting, we are going to be concerned in terms of studying issues such as labor, such as impacts on gender, such as impacts on public health. So in that sense, once again, it goes back to what the country wants in terms of the decision. And as far as I know, there's no country that has actually accepted any technology without a biosafety assessment to date. That's my understanding. And even in the US, there's no automatic acceptance. There is a risk assessment and a biosafety assessment process before releasing a technology.
The only biosafety assessment that they're capable of doing in this country right now is only the plant biosafety. Just plant, not the human biosafety. There are no intentions, no funding, no expertise to do human biosafety assessment. So I challenge your statement. Number 2, I'd like to remind you that when you brought up the possibility that if the biosafety assessment is failed, and then the socioeconomic assessment passes, your opinion was that it would still be approved.
Dr. Zepeda, before you answer that question, maybe it would be better, sir, for a thorough discussion if the two of you could just have an exchange of email or that, sir, because our time is quite limited. We would not like to call on Dr. Necesito, who raised his hand a few minutes ago.
Thank you very much. Now, actually, I made this observation, or I asked this question before, but I will not be able to answer this. But it seems that Japan and Europe and Britain, basically, they are not rather cozy with the GMOs. Japan, both countries are not afraid of nuclear energy. The Philippines, on the other hand, is afraid of nuclear energy, but not GMO. We allow GMO here. In fact, the Philippines is the only country in Southeast Asia, and maybe even in Asia, that tested GMO rice. Why? It was tested in the Philippines. I don't know, I'm not tested elsewhere. But that's besides the point. I know that GMOs must start with something else. When we look at biodiversity and its sustainability, and it means worldwide, global and national. And yet in application it seems to be converging towards monopolistic tendency. But the ownership of these important, maybe wild type, in fact, our own very well protected, legal, and a truly patent situation. So there seems to be a monopolistic tendency to be owned by the big corporations in the world, where the whole world is the playground. Thank you. You can make some comment on that.
No, you raised a lot of tough issues and tough questions, and let me track back a little bit in terms of our interest as IFPRI, as the International Food Policy Research Institute, is not really the developed countries and the multinationals. Our interest lies in the crops and traits of interest of or for developing countries. So in that sense, and most of them in that sense, they're of a public good nature in themselves, meaning that if the public sector in the different countries do not pick them up, there's not going to be a lot of addressing. So for example, if we're talking about sweet potatoes, we're talking about eggplant, we're talking about eggplant, not yet such a good example, but the bananas in Uganda might be a good example. The cowpeas, the cassavas, all of these crops and traits that are being developed by the public sector, if they're not of interest to Mozambique, they're not commercial products, they will never be commercial products, except in perhaps a couple of markets around the world. So in that sense, that is our interest, and that's where the issue of innovation becomes important. It's the public sector that is important. Certainly, there is quite a bit of an issue in terms of the monopolistic behavior of some of the companies, but at the same time, some of the studies I have conducted and a couple of other people have conducted, there are limits to that behavior at the same time. So it's not an easy question just to say because there's multinationals, they will control the market completely. There are limitations to that. So there's a lot of issues. The biodiversity aspect is extremely important, and I think this is one of the places where we have to start thinking about a little bit more carefully about what are the policies that we have to have in place to actually maintain the biodiversity, both the agricultural biodiversity itself, the different variabilities in terms of land races, varieties, cultivars, and crops used by farmers in developing countries, but also biodiversity in general. And in some cases, this is a little bit of an opening the discussion in terms of what is going to be needed, for example, to intensify agriculture in essence so that we do not continue, for example, cutting down tropical forests around the world, because that will help reduce the pressures on the agricultural system. So increasing efficiency, increasing productivity, that becomes one way to actually cope with some of these issues. So these are a lot of difficult questions, and one of the interesting things perhaps is been some of the developments, for example, with the Plant Genetic Resources Treaty, where it seeks to protect a lot of them. For example, the plant systems and the plant collections that are being put in trust at this moment. A lot of the seed systems have been put in trust for the benefit of mankind. And some of the initial efforts to conserve some of this biodiversity I think are becoming much more enhanced. Certainly much more needs to be done than what has been done today. But yes, that's an important question. And of course, we at one point have to come up, we have to get into this arena and into these policy discussions, because And we were talking with a couple of people. One thing is, do we want, for example, as a country, or the Philippines wants as a country to be food secure, or does it want to be food sufficient? Or does it want to be self-sufficient, for example, in the production of rice? That type of discussions will have different policy implications and different consequences in terms of biodiversity, food security, hunger and poverty, and so on. And then, of course, there's the bigger picture discussion of whether or not agriculture is truly the future of agricultural development and prosperity. Well, maybe, maybe not. And that's where the countries have to start making these decisions in that sense. So yes, but thank you for bringing this up. This is extremely interesting proposition. By the way, like I said, the Cartagena program Biosafety is about biodiversity in the end, protecting and enhancing biodiversity. Yes.
We have room for one last question. Yes.
Veronica Sinohin from Ecosystems Research Development Bureau, Department of Environment and Natural Resources. You mentioned earlier that one of the drives for inclusion of socioeconomics is due to Cartagena Protocol, Article 26.1. My question is, in doing your ex-ante and post-ante, could you suggest, or what are the kind of data that you require to submit by the proponent to serve as reference to answer the questions that you have listed? For example, the feasibility, fit of decision-making process, utility, and regulatory impacts. The kind of data that you require, or the kind of data that you gathered when you conducted the post-ante and the ex-ante.
Yeah. Well, let me separate two different things. One is the data requirements for the assessments themselves, whether or not we're measuring the potential impact, for example, of a BT Roundup ready maize in Philippines versus, say, black Sigatoka resistant banana in Uganda. These are very different than the requirements for conducting the regulatory impact assessment of the assessment itself, right? These are two separate issues. If we're talking about a technology assessment, we're talking usually about prices, quantities, labor, input use, output destination, the distribution of the pest, for example, the incidence of the weeds, different types of products that will actually allow you to come up with a conclusion or an outcome in terms of benefits or cost or benefits to farmers, including in some cases, in the particular case of developing countries' economies, the issue is perhaps not profit, but it's in some cases ensuring survival, for example, ensuring a minimum amount of rice or maize to ensure survival of the family, for example. That brings us to that part of the estimation, which is kind of trying to figure out what is relevant for farmers. Let me give you an example. In the case of Honduras, where I come from, farmers usually plant three different types of maize. One for self-consumption, which is a very old traditional variety, which produces a lot of very high-quality grains in one part of the cob, but that's used to make flour and make little flat, they're called tortillas in Central America and Mexico. But there's the two other types, which are basically a hybrid in many cases, where one is basically used or the one of the two are used in combination to actually produce grain for selling for the feed industry and so on. That's basically a cash crop. So we have a subsistence crop and a cash crop. So in that sense, the type of analysis that will be done may even differ within a farmer, because we have two different sets of markets that are actually supplying to in that sense. One is self-consumption, the other one is a cash crop. Now, if you're talking about the type of the second part, which is a regulatory impact assessment, meaning that you want to consider whether or not the inclusion of socioeconomics or any other biosafety requirement is worthwhile or is a desired proposition, there you would have to kind of get a sense of the cost of the different components that are used in the biosafety assessment, the different activities that are being done. For example, what does it cost to the Philippine society to actually do, for example, let's say a characterization of the event itself, a description of the event, the confined field trials, what does it cost to actually conduct a laboratory, and so on. So these are the direct costs. And then the other part of the story is perhaps some of the institutional costs. How much does it cost for the National Biosafety Authority to meet? how much does it cost for the developer itself to actually submit that application and so on. So once you start adding those costs, then you have to start considering what is the timelines that are actually required for those particular activities, and then kind of get a sense of what are the benefits, what is it that I'm going to obtain in the end, better information and so on. That's more or less the process for the regulatory impact assessment itself. But like I said, there are two different things. Where ex-ante, ex-post is basically a technology assessment where you get different data, and some of it was reflected in the graph I presented, but those are not the only ones, by the way.
Thank you, Dr. Zepeda.